Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today it is part 2 of my 2020 Overwatch League post-season power rankings. If you did not catch part 1, I will link to it in the description and in the cards, but if you want a quick little preview of where I had the previous 10 teams, here's a look at 20 through 11 real quickly. If you want more of an explanation on these positions and why I have the teams where I have them, watch the video from Wednesday. Before I jump into 10 through 1, I just want to real quickly say that, of course, these are my opinions. It's very difficult this time around when you have two different regions that didn't have a ton of cross-regional play. It's slightly easier with the top 10 because more teams in the top 10 have had cross-regional play. New York, Seoul, Shanghai, Philadelphia, San Francisco. These are all teams who have played, at least in some degree, cross-regionally, so it's a little bit easier to kind of place them. But in general, like I said, these are my opinions and my thoughts on it. So if you disagree and want to leave your own thoughts in the comments down below, I would love to hear from you. But let's jump in. Let's start with number 10, where I have the Los Angeles Gladiators. Now, this kind of group here, 10 through 8, is going to be a very interesting one, and we'll see as I go on a little more. The Gladiators are a team that actually were about where I expected them to be this season, maybe a little bit better than what I expected them to be, and a lot of that came down to how great of a year Birdring had and how strong Kevster was when they added him to the team. OG and Space were both solid. Space, in particular, was very, very good. OG had his problems throughout the season, he had his ups and his downs, but I think a kind of restructure and a reworking of how this team kind of goes forward is going to be able to help that. And Shaz and Big Goose are both still very good and still very consistent. Arguably the best Western support duo. Hate to see them now both be taken away from this roster, but I still think that these are two very good players wherever they end up. But the Gladiators were an interesting team this season. I think their biggest struggle ended up being consistency issues. OG struggled a little too often, I think, for this team to be able to be a consistent contender for a really top spot. And for so much of the early season in particular, their DPS position was just not very good. Birdring was really kind of carrying fights and matches, and both Mir and Jaru were not really contributing a bunch. Mirror did at times. He had certain heroes in particular that he was very good on. Kevster coming in was a huge addition for this team, and I think that he really kind of saved it in a lot of ways. I think they're a team that going forward should be pretty good, and they should be able to do a lot with some of these Ps that are already on the team, but ultimately they are, for me, the 10th team here in 2020. Moving on to number 9, I have the other Los Angeles team, the LA Valiant, one spot ahead of the Gladiators for a couple of reasons. They only ended the season with one additional win. They were 12-10 versus the Gladiators 11-10. The Valiant getting that additional win from the Melee. The Valiant were, I think, consistently better than the Gladiators. The Valiant never beat the Gladiators, of course, which is something you can definitely use that against the Valiant. You could say, hey, should they be ahead of the Gladiators? But we'll get there. I thought the Valiant were just a better team. They were more well-rounded. They had some problems, but I think that in general they had more consistent play out of every player and every position. Their DPS line was incredible, whether it was KSP, Shax, KSF. Those three in particular were really, really good for this team and provided a ton for this team and really were able to elevate this team. Apply didn't play a ton, that's why I didn't mention him, but he only played a couple times, so I don't want this to be like me really like dissing Apply. He just didn't play a lot. I thought the tank line was pretty good. McGravy was better than I think people expected him to be. Dreamer was okay. Definitely not an elite tank line, but still pretty good. And the support line I thought was pretty solid with Astro and Rain. So was it the best roster in the league? By no means, but I think they were really, really, really elevated by how strong their DPS play was. KSP was one of the best players of this season. Like, if Alarm hadn't been just so incredible on Flexport, I think KSP would have had a really good case of Rookie of the Year. And this Valiant team had some wins against some very good teams. Obviously, they beat the Shock early in the season. The Gladiators did as well, so doesn't matter that much. But Valiant, like I said, big win against the Shock early on. They were undefeated against the Florida Mayhem, a very good team, a very good roster there. So this Valiant team really does have a lot to kind of show for their efforts and their work. And I think that the performances they've had kind of more consistently, and I think the overall strength that they showed throughout the season is why I gave them the edge over the LA Gladiators. Moving on to number 8, I have the Florida Mayhem. This feels low, but it also, just based on the other teams that I looked at, whatnot, feels right. So here's where the Florida Mayhem obviously didn't beat the LA Valiant at all this season, but they also never lost to the LA Gladiators. So the triangle, all three teams and around the same area. The Mayhem were just ever so slightly better. Obviously, this past week, we saw a ton of announcements coming out of the Florida Mayhem on player releases. Saya player Chris, Byram, Korean. So an interesting team going forward to see how they change what they have so far. But Yaki, a very good player this season, as well as BQB. I thought Fate and Gargoyle had a great year. And Gangnam Jin was one of the best flex supports in North America by far. So a really good Florida Mayhem team that had a bit of a struggle early in the season, really kind of surged through the May Melee and the Summer Showdown until, they lost to Houston in the Summer Showdown. Had a pretty good performance in the Countdown Cup, but ultimately the Mayhem were not able to really kind of be that big juggernaut that I think they are becoming. And I think some changes going forward could really elevate this Mayhem team to be a serious contender with some of the best teams in the league. And I think we're really just kind of seeing the beginning of what this Mayhem team is capable of. I think this Mayhem team is going to be very good. I think there is a ton of potential for this Mayhem team to be a top 5 team potentially in the future, depending on how they work this offseason and what types of moves they make, the types of players they bring in. But overall, I think the Mayhem were a very good team this season. And I think that you consider the fact that they were a top 4 team in North America. 100%, they were one of the best teams in North America. Even if you were to compare them to some of the Asian teams, that they would have been better than, I think, Hangzhou and Chengdu and London. I mean, that's a pretty good thing to have going in your favor. So this is a Mayhem team that really impressed me this year, and I have them here at number 8. Moving on to number 7, I have the New York Excelsior, slightly above the Florida Mayhem. For me, it really comes down to the fact that New York was struggling in a very good Asia region, really only against Shanghai and Guangzhou. They had a loss to Chengdu, they had a loss to Hangzhou. Other than that, they were consistent against those two teams and London. They struggled against Guangzhou this year, kind of back and forth between those two. So a little bit difficult to really kind of place this Excelsior team at times, but I think it was a very competitive division in general and a competitive region. New York's biggest problems this season came down to just consistency, problems with roster stuff happening. Of course, Nene being stuck in North America for a time when the team first moved back to Asia. Bringing in Haksal and the roster never really gelling together. Questionable play out of the off-tank position. Hapa never really got it together, and Bianca didn't have enough of a chance to play late in the season or throughout the season to really kind of cement himself as potentially a starter going forward. And there was obviously some problems with the hit scan DPS position in general, with players like SPB and Libero filling in the reins sometimes, and it didn't really feel right. So there was a lot of questions I think this New York roster had. They're still an incredibly talented roster. They are a team that I think, because they were in Asia, we look at them a little bit weaker than maybe they really were. There's a chance this was realistically a top 5 team in the league, a top 4 team in the league, but because of their struggles against some of the teams in Asia and how strong Asia was and the fact that they had to play Shanghai so often, they ended up dipping, I think, lower than realistically where they would be. So this is a New York roster that I think ultimately is a very good team and is a strong, solid team, but their season performance as a whole was a little disappointing, and they were never really able to put anything together throughout the season. No tournament wins, no real success in any major way. third in APAC, both in standings and in the playoffs. They did okay, but ultimately they were never really able to do anything too impressive. Moving on to number 6, I have the Paris Eternal. Paris Eternal, just ahead of New York. Some kind of close spots, these next 3, I think. But the thing that really had me put the Paris Eternal here instead of any higher was just that they were kind of a good team that had success at different times throughout the season. But really, they kind of peaked in the Summer Showdown. They had a really good month in June and July. And they had a pretty good month in August as well, going into the Countdown Cup. But they didn't look very good in the playoffs, and they really just were never able to get things together when the meta wasn't a Genji meta. It seemed very much like they really wanted to force Sparkle, which I can't blame them. Sparkle's a very good player. You want to play your best player whenever you can. But I think that sometimes you have to realize that you can't always play your best player, and sometimes you have to make changes. It's something that Philadelphia did. You know, they know Carpe is a really important player and a very good player and arguably the most talented player on their roster. But they knew that there were times that you can't sit Carpe. And I think this is just a learning experience the Eternal will learn from. I'm curious to see what types of moves they make in the offseason. I still think they need a main tank player. As improved as Ben Best and No Smite were this season, I still don't think they are going to be good enough to lead this Paris Eternal team to a championship. So I think that the Paris Eternal have some changes that need to be made. I think they have some moves to make to improve, but they had a very good season. I think they are definitely one of the top teams from the 2020 season. Moving into our top 5, at number 5, I have the Seoul Dynasty. Now, this is an interesting spot. Obviously, a team that struggled a lot in the regular season, finishing with a 12-12 -7 record. Realistically, this team was 9-12, but 3 tournament wins from getting second in the May Melee and then finishing top 4 in the Summer Showdown. So they end up at 12-12 with a -7 differential. But I've said the same thing about Seoul all season. This is a team that did not care about the regular season. They cared about the playoffs and they cared about the tournaments. And when big moments came, this Seoul Dynasty team was at their best. They almost won the May Melee. They looked pretty good in the Summer Showdown. They had a competitive series with the Hangzhou Spark in the Countdown Cup. And, of course, they were in the grand finals of the 2020 season. The only thing that keeps them, for me, below a team like the Guangzhou Charge is just that the Guangzhou Charge had more consistency throughout the season. They were able to get that Summer Showdown win, that big upset over the Shanghai Dragons in some pretty dominant fashion. I think this whole Dynasty is still very good, and of course I have them at 5. That's a very good spot to be in, but ultimately I think that there was just not enough going on in the regular season to keep them in a top 4 spot. A top 4 team shouldn't have to struggle in the regular season. They shouldn't have a losing record in the regular season, even if they do get those additional wins. Like, that's the only reason why they had a not losing record, was because they got additional wins. This is a team that you should be able to beat enough teams and not struggle, I think, to be a top 4 team. So as good as they were, as much as things worked for them, a lot of their grand finals run, I think, came down to a meta that worked for them. I still think this is a team that struggled to not having an off-tank, like a true off-tank, until very late in the season. And at that point, what are you going to do with 2U? If he's your only off-tank and you bring him in pretty much right at the end of the season, it's very difficult to get a lot out of him. So I like the Seoul Dynasty a lot. I think that they had a very good season, of course. Making the grand finals is no small feat, but ultimately, I think the Seoul Dynasty are the number 5 team from the 2020 season. Moving on to number 4, team I just mentioned, the Guangzhou Charge. An interesting spot. It feels very weird. This kind of 4, 5, and 6 spot was very difficult for me because the Guangzhou Charge were not great down the stretch. They struggled a lot late in the season. They were really good in May, and they were really good for the Summer Showdown, and they were pretty good at the Countdown Cup. But beyond the Countdown Cup, including the Countdown Cup, and the playoffs, they were just not really that good. They got beaten pretty handily by the Seoul Dynasty in the playoffs, and then beaten pretty handily again by the NYXL. Some interesting decisions, some interesting compositions I don't think were very good on their part. The playoffs were weird. The meta was different, and I think that it didn't really work for what the Guangzhou Charge are as a team. But what they showed throughout the season was consistency. They showed high-level play throughout the season. And I think that they were ultimately slightly better than the Seoul Dynasty and the Paris Eternal as a whole, considering their season that was. I think they are a team that likely can be better. There's some interesting stuff that happened considering this team had a ton of just crazy things happen. Obviously, you had Neptuno had to leave, and Nero had to leave, and then they never really were able to kind of get worked back into the roster. Chara becomes a starter again over Neptuno. There was just so much craziness that happened with this Charge team that the fact that they had such a good season is very impressive. And you had some very good performances from Eileen and from Happy. This is a team that I think really showed up this season. They were incredibly surprising. I did not think they would be this good this year. I had them kind of middle of the pack in my preseason power rankings, but a top 4 team for sure, in my opinion, following this season. And I think going forward, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Nero, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with Crystal being on this roster now. But for me, the Charge just narrowly taking that number 4 spot, edging out the Seoul Dynasty and the Paris Eternal. Moving on to number 3, I have the Philadelphia Fusion. Disappointing performance from them in the grand finals. Obviously, with 0-6, losing to both the Seoul Dynasty and Shanghai Dragons. But their regular season was very good. Best record in North America as a whole. And also struggling in tournaments, which was something that definitely hurt them. But incredibly dominant. They showed to be a very good team with relatively strong play in every meta, with the exception of the grand finals meta. This is a team that had a very good year. A ton of really big name players on this team, a ton of really good star players. And you have to give a lot of credit to what this Philadelphia Fusion team was able to do this year with the new pieces. I think that one of the biggest problems for this team was that they didn't have the kind of solid team play coordination and just kind of organized play that you see from a lot of top teams. Shanghai and San Francisco were both incredibly well organized. They were well-oiled machines. They knew how to play a lot together. But I think that this is a team that going forward, if they can kind of clean up their team play and their team coordination and really kind of play more to their strength as a group as opposed to relying on strengths of individual players, I think this is a team that could be really, really good once again. I think this is still a potential championship team, but their very weak performances against San Francisco throughout most of the season. Obviously, one win over the team. Their bad performance against Shanghai and Seoul in the grand finals, to me, really solidifies them here as this number 3 team. They're not better than Shanghai. They're not better than San Francisco. So that puts them here at number 3. At number 2, I have the Shanghai Dragons. While they had the best record throughout the regular season, they did not really perform at a super high level come playoff time. They weren't bad, but they just were never able to put it together, and they ended up losing to the Seoul Dynasty and, of course, the San Francisco Shock. But what the Dragons were able to do was incredible. The fact that they had a roster of 6 players that lost like 3 maps all season is incredible and insane, and it's incredibly impressive for a team that had been thrown together relatively, recently. They didn't have a whole season playing together. Very few of these players had any experience playing with each other in the past, if any at all. So, Shanghai Dragons are a very good team. It's not easy to have the best record in the league, especially in a region as tough as Asia, where you have New York and Guangzhou and Seoul and Hangzhou and Chengdu, and even London, who pushed the Shanghai Dragons team a couple times. What Shanghai did was impressive, but they just couldn't go that extra distance. They couldn't win that final gauntlet of the playoffs. And the fact that they didn't make the grand finals, I think, is really kind of the kicker. And that's really the thing where you say you can't say this is the best team. when they lost before they even made it to the grand finals. They couldn't make it that far. So a very good team. Nothing to take away from them other than, they didn't make it as far as they wanted to, but still a very strong team, and one that I think going forward will be serious title contenders moving into 2021. Finally, at number 1, of course, is the San Francisco Shock. Repeat champions back-to-back, exactly where I had them at the beginning of the season. I doubted them all season, and I thought that they weren't going to make it all season. And then it came to the Countdown Cup, and I just resigned and said, it's a shock year, man. And yeah, I thought Shanghai would win the playoffs, but it was all shock. Shock, shock, shock. A very good year from them. Obviously, a few losses here and there. 3 regular season losses, as well as a loss in the Summer Showdown. But that was it. That was it. And their loss to the Fusion, of course. That was it. 3 regular season losses, a loss in the Summer Showdown, and they won every other game they played. Not even Shanghai can say they did the same, because they lost 2 regular season matches, they lost the Summer Showdown, and they lost 2 matches in the playoffs. So you have a very good team in the Shanghai Dragons, but a better team in the San Francisco Shock. I'm really impressed with what the Shock were able to do with so much turmoil this season. Obviously, Sinatra leaves, Architect gets traded, you bring in Twilight and Tayo, and there was a lot of just weird things going on with the Shock team, but they were able to stay consistent and stay dominant, and they stand atop of the world once again as the best team in Overwatch. So that is my power rankings for 10 through 1. Here's a quick look at the whole 20-team power rankings for you all to soak in. Let me know your thoughts on my rankings in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this in the future. But with that officially ends my coverage of the 2020 Overwatch League season. But don't you worry, because we are moving very quickly into 2021 with free agency and trades and all that stuff coming and happening as we speak. So, while this is it for 2020, it is only a new beginning as we move forward. But for now, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you once again. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.